Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about a wonderful subject that I think sometimes a lot of us would actually feel a lot more comfort if we could actually reach deep and really believe. And that is the feeling that we're all interconnected, not just with each other, but with the entire world around us and even the universe. After all, many of us strive today to believe that the power of intention and the law of attraction will help us achieve the kind of bliss and life that we would like to have. But sometimes there's that little bit of doubt that helps us try to think that, well, maybe it just isn't for us, but it's good for everybody else. On our program today, we're going to be talking with an investigative journalist and author who is sought after public speaker from around the world. She is also author of the book, The Intention Experiment, and today we're going to be talking about her new book, simply titled The Bond. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Miss Lynne McTaggart. Lynne, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Delighted to be here.
You bet. It's been a while. How did the Intention Experiment actually go?
Well, it's going really well.
Still going. Okay.
In the past 4 years, we've run 23 experiments, all scientifically, conducted with controls, blinded to the scientists, so they never knew what target we'd chosen. And we sent intention to make plants grow faster on multiple occasions. We purified water, we changed water pH, and we even had an experiment, very provocative experiment, showing that pretty conclusively that we lowered violence in a war-torn area. And we had a team of scientists working on that one from University of Arizona to University of California at Davis. So although, obviously more studies need to be done, particularly on something like a peace intention experiment, because one study does not a science make. There certainly is lots of interesting evidence that's been appearing thus far, and our experiment is ongoing. We're planning some more experiments in 2012.
Now, what's really fascinating when people pick up your book, The Bond, is that you start off talking about the history of science and how in many ways science, probably not meaning to, sort of separated the world into its individual components, and we were kind of left with that dogma for for quite a few years, actually. And it went just out of the world of, let's say, physics, but also the same thing with genetics as well. But it seems that over the last 10, 15 years, we have just been breaking those ceilings like crazy to really begin to realize that things just aren't as, let's say, static or, separate as we once used to believe.
Well, that's right. Everybody thinks of science as this absolute truth, but science is just a story, and it's told in installments. And one installment may define who we are and what life is for a while until another installment comes along and smashes that ceiling, as you say, and we see that there's an entirely new paradigm. So for 300 plus years, we've had this view of the world as divided into separate things, and these little separate things are completely and utterly self-contained, and they don't have effects on each other unless you do something physical from one thing to another thing. And we also had this view post-Darwin that most of these things are in competition to survive, and competition was the driving engine of the universe. But the new science that's coming forward, and this is why I wrote The Bond, I didn't want to just write about physics, I wanted to write about biology, psychology, all the ologies essentially, was to show that, that the new science emerging says that nature's basic drive is not for competition but for wholeness. Nature is created us to seek wholeness above just about anything else other than food. And we're not made for competition. We were made for cooperation. We were made to share, care, and be fair. And we're in the mess we're in the crises we are at the moment because we're living against nature. We're living competitive when we should be living cooperatively.
Now, it's real interesting because in The Bond, we could kind of jump into the book here, is the fact that it's also the way that we perceive or we think about the world. And it's really interesting because as I was reading about the differences between Western and Eastern thought, the way that we actually perceive or experience the world, I couldn't have agreed with you more about a lot of things. Now, first of all, my wife happens to be from the Filipino culture, okay? Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting because I grew up in Western culture, especially in America. It's about individualism. Certainly, in my day and age, I was certainly expected that by the time I was 18, regardless of what I did after high school, I had to have it figured out enough that I was simply to go and move out and figure it all out and live on my own. Whereas she was saying, well, you know, kind of in our culture that doesn't happen. Kids kind of leave the home when they're good and ready whenever there's time to. You know, it's about family and they stay together. And I thought that's interesting. And then the other thing, too, is I used to work as a food server in the restaurant industry, and I remember that it was always so, to me, I always got a kick out of what Asians would come in to eat, especially the Japanese and the Chinese, because they would come in as a group, they would all order, but everything got put into the middle of the table and they all shared versus us sitting over our plates like we're in a prison. You know? and so I'm looking at what you were writing and I'm saying, you know, you're so right about the way we perceive things, you know, the way we view art, for instance, you know, how you were talking about the Mona Lisa and Westward kind of looking at her facial features, whereas, you know, in the East they're looking at the trees in the background and the like, and it's really interesting that how you can shift your perception, and how the world can actually change around you just based on that simple thing.
Well, this is the interesting thing. You know, how we're taught to view the world, it ultimately becomes how we think. And we've been taught to view the world as individualistic, and we've been taught to look for the beef. You know, that's basically what Americans and Westerners are taught to do. Look for the thing, the central thing, because that grows out of the way we're taught to be individual. You know, we're taught from a very young age to be separate, to be individual, to be self-propelled. We get put in a separate cot very quickly, a separate crib. We're asked very at a young age to make individual decisions. You know, is it going to be Barney or Sesame Street? You know, do you want the red pen or the blue pen? And also when we're taught to read like Fun with Dick and Jane. If you're my age, that's what you read. If you're a baby, everybody listening, I suppose, is a baby boomer, was read Fun with Dick and Jane. And those kinds of books extolled the comings and goings of individuals. You know, look, Jane, see Dick run, you know, and that kind of thing. And so we were taught to focus on the individual. An Easterner, a Japanese person, will see things very differently because he's taught from a young age that everything is interpenetrating and connected. And, you know, his first books are things like this. You know, little brother is sitting with big brother looks after little brother loves big brother. They're taught about relationship. Whatever they do, there's an effect on something else. There's a relationship. So that begins to govern the way they see. So after a while, they've noticed that Westerners see very differently than Easterners. Easterners, their eyes flit around much faster and they take in much more than we do. We're always just looking for the thing, or we're looking for what's like me, what's in it for me, what's like me, and that's what we train our attention on.
Mm-hmm. Also, too, I was going to mention, I remember many years ago as I was beginning to study Eastern philosophy and thought, there was a part in a particular book I was reading that talked about, for instance, the difference in art. They say that with the Asians, with Chinese, or even the Japanese, when you take a look at their art, they pull back and you see maybe a little individual possibly standing, you know, on a bridge or under, you know, an eaves or whatever the case is, maybe with someone else or just by themselves. But then there's the waterfall, and then there's the weeping willow trees, and I mean, they're a part of nature, whereas take a look at this European view. Here's a guy standing in front of a curtain with a smirk. Here I am. And I thought that was so funny.
Yes.
And you can see the contrast beauty between the way one thought is versus the other. And I thought, I think I'll go with the Eastern point of view. It just seems warmer.
Yes, absolutely.
Now,
absolutely.
One of the things that really stood out for me, and I really would like you to expound on this a little bit, was the mirror neuron. The way we tend to copycat or take on or even come into synchronicity with each other. And that, to me, was really interesting. It kind of made me see things a little bit different.
Well, we're convinced that our individuality has a few big signatures, and one of the big signatures is that our thoughts are our own. So we think. And our thoughts are supposed to be wholly generated by our brain. But scientists have now discovered that there is such a thing as mirror neurons, which is when you watch a thought, or you watch an action or an emotion of somebody else's, the very same neurons fire in you as fire if you were having that emotion, you were engaging in that action. So in other words, we understand the world by simulating it mentally. We simulate it neurologically. And what that actually means is that we temporarily merge with it. Mm-hmm. Your actions and emotions essentially become mine for that moment. And so even though we think of our thoughts as being wholly and exclusively ours, they're actually a complex mix of ourselves and everyone else around us. So the reason I made this point in detail in the book is because it starts getting a little messy here, because, it's hard to separate out what exactly exclusively comes from me and what exactly exclusively comes from you. Where do I end and you begin? And that's mimicked in so many different ways through nature. My point was really nature has designed us with a bond, which is a connection so profound and integral that it's impossible to separate one and say where one ends and another begins. And that's surely the case in so many ways with us.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting how we tend to, as we were saying earlier, to feel separated when in fact we all really have the urge to feel and experience many of the same things. We have the desire to be loved, to be appreciated, and even to be respected. And when you feel like there's a sense of a lack of those things, you can see how that connection is actually made through someone else to actually make improvements in that area so that things get a little bit better, I'd say.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the thing about it is I remember years ago when I had a chance to review a video which was on Monty Roberts, known as the Horse Whisperer. And I began to realize the genius in what he was doing as he described what it is about horses and how they actually work, and how he applied basically horse philosophy, if you will, to being able to help with troubled boys. He's got a wonderful ranch where really troubled boys, they come to this ranch and they're involved in the process of not just healing but actually contributing and actually learning more about themselves. And what it is that when you make a mistake, you happen to be a horse within a group, that you're basically pushed out of the group for a while, and horses tend to be community animals just like humans. And that means that when that horse is pushed aside, that its survival rate's going to go down into the can until it's allowed to be back into the group, because a horse can't simply survive on its own. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because people are pretty much the same way. They want to really be involved to be able to identify with a group, no matter how radical it can be. Talk about what that is within inside of us, where we have the need to belong to people, no matter how much sometimes it may hurt us.
Well, we have such a need to belong that it's really a matter of life or death. Even though our mythology in America is just the opposite. Mm-hmm. We really extol the lone wolf hero, the guy who's got his fist up against the establishment. That's our idea in America of a great hero. And, he has lots of different guises. Probably the most, one of the most typical, and the one who most typifies our hero is Gary Cooper, who played Howard Rourke in the movie version of The Fountainhead, the book by Ayn Rand, which sold millions and millions of copies in America. In this movie, and in, of course, the book, Howard Rourke is an architect, and he builds a housing project that gets tampered with by the establishment, and so he blows it up rather than allow his creation to be bastardized. And in his trial, because of course he's defaced a community project, in his trial, and he just chooses to defend himself, he basically stands up during his summation and delivers what is basically Ayn Rand's, he becomes her mouthpiece for her objectivist philosophy, which is basically a love song to individualism. And he says, I do not owe 1 minute of my life to anyone else. I have the right to live completely for myself, and it's self-sacrifice that's basically destroying us. And so this is a love song to selfishness, basically. And as I say, this was viewed as being really part of the American way, the American establishment. And he gets off, he ends up being acquitted despite blowing up a city block, and he gets his girl, and, he's kind of triumphant at the end. But the real point in my book, as I say, is that he's also a candidate, the perfect candidate for a heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say this is that human beings need belonging above all else, maybe other than food. And we need to feel we're belonging. Suicides kill themselves, usually as psychologists put it, because they suffer from excessive individuation. They feel left out, and that's the one feeling they cannot bear. They also, we also find that connecting with anyone, even relationships, bad relationships is better than no relationships. And it's, really, it's
No,
protective.
I know what you mean, because I was thinking over the years about how many times I've heard a girlfriend or a boyfriend of mine talk about just the fact, they're treating me like this, and I'm thinking, well, why do you stay? Because it's better not to be. It's better than being alone.
It's better than being alone. Well, the thing is, it's actually better for your health. Studies have shown that connection of any sort is so protective health-wise. It protects us against heart disease, because we know from studies that only half of people who have heart attacks have the usual risk factors. The other people, according to people like Dr. Dean Ornish, the other people, 50%, have heart attacks and die of simple loneliness. They literally die of a broken heart. So connection of all sorts protects us against heart disease, but also stroke, even the common cold. Depression, they find the poorest people in America do not suffer depression so long as they have two things: a strong spiritual belief, but even more importantly, a strong spiritual community. So community protects us in hard times, and it seems to be probably the best medicine we have. I think if you decide to join even just one community group, you cut your chances of dying in the next year by half.
Well, they were also saying, too, that is one of the keys to longevity, especially in the later years, that when you tend to take a person who is aging and you say, well, we're all a little bit too busy right now, but it's obvious that you can't manage yourself too well, you need to be looked after. They pull them out of the home and they put them into an assisted living home. And then the family may tend to get a little too busy to not be able to go and visit. The group activities, at least this is the old paradigm. These are really changing, as we've featured many times on our program here, about how there is a lot more community involvement, or even living in home, aging in places they call it. But that they tend to kind of shuffle off the elderly as though their use in society is done. It's almost become, as I remember quoting at one time, a throwaway society. And I said, you go to other places around the world, and this just doesn't exist. An interesting example of that was a couple that we featured on our program who, at the age of 66, both the husband and the wife embarked on a journey across the Gobi Desert. Now, that's a pretty hell of a big feat, believe it or not, but they achieved it.
Yes.
But there was a point where they were actually crossing where they were close to the border of Russia, and they were actually stopped by the Chinese government, I guess, call it the patrol, if you will. They were wondering, what are you doing here? So they took them into custody. But what they said they experienced the whole time was there was such a tremendous level of respect paid to them, because that's how it is in that culture. But yet in America, we view aging as sort of this unusual disease, when in fact And many indigenous cultures through history, for instance, even, the Native Americans of North America, you name it, wherever you want to go, the elders were the cornerstones of the survival of the tribe or the group. And you go,
yes.
What in the hell went wrong here? Strange.
I know. Well, it was that idea of separation and separate and competitive.
Mm-hmm.
Different cultures have a sense of, they have a strong sense of a community, but we have atomized, as I put it in the book. We've pulled apart more and more and more just so we seek people who are just like us, and we distrust people who are not like us. And our neighborhoods have now fallen apart because we now have the fastest growing neighborhood in America is a gated community. And that is a giant group of people just like us, a giant group of eyes. And, this has become our sense that as you become more individualistic, you look to verify yourself in other people, too. So you want people with identical belief systems. So more and more we're fracturing into those tiny groups. And that's one of our crises, is this idea of, individualism to that degree. Now, I just want to say here, though, I'm not advocating socialism or communism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that we should have across-the-board sameness or, totally imitate the Japanese experience. But I'm saying that we have, by individualizing to this degree and using competition as the engine of our society, of every area of our lives, that it's destroying us. This is where we've got to. This is what selfish looks like. Selfish looks like no neighborhoods. It looks like a severely fractured society, very polarized. It has a greatly unfair society. America, all Western cultures are suffering from unfairness, but America most of all, because there's such a divide now. 1 in 39 people is a millionaire, and 39 million people in America live below the poverty line. 39 million. Mm-hmm. Now, again, I'm not talking about having the money from the 1 in 39 millionaires handed over to the people below the poverty line, and redistributed. But what I'm talking about is lack of fair opportunity, lack of fair basics in life taken care of, or opportunity to have them taken care of, all sorts of things like that. And the biggest problem of all is when things are unfair, as they are now, everybody suffers, rich and poor. Mm-hmm. Scientists, this is one of the most fascinating parts of my book to myself, is researching evidence showing that when things are unfair, and this is research on populations, all Western populations, the more unfair any society, the more it is everyone, rich and poor, suffers on all social indicators like health care, mental health, crime and violence, education. And of all Western countries, we in America, we with the richest country in the world, the most resource, we're on the bottom of every social indicator. We have the worst statistics of everyone. Now, 1 in 4 of us has a mental health problem. That's just insanity now. And it's a total and direct outgrowth of unfairness.
It's interesting, Lynn, because as I was, when you bring up the unfairness thing, I remember some time ago there was an acquaintance of ours. Basically, we're just going to call him a hippie. Okay, this guy was sitting on a nice big piece of property with this big, dreamy project that he was going to put together, which through all intentions really made a lot of sense. It was about growing organically and naturally. It was about being able to set up where you could actually sell the goods, basically to get people back into the garden is what this whole thing is. And anyway, so he sat on this piece of property, and when I came to know him, he had already been on the property a good couple of years as it was. And he was sitting around with another friend of his who, as much as they detested money and they detested consumerism and capitalism, you couldn't get them to stop about the millions of dollars they were about to inherit from, I don't know, the last I heard the money was stuck in Mexico, and that was several years ago. And I just remember sitting with these guys in this room, and we were talking, we can't stand, on the one hand, they couldn't stand capitalism, but boy, they got excited about talking about money, especially if it came to falling into their laps to get this project launched. And they were sitting on 35 acres, which I guess used to be a working farm anyway. I remember as we were there, the owner came into the room, and he's basically, so what's going on today, guys? And by now, this is 5 years they've been doing this. And apparently had been paying no rent. They were using the resources there and the whole bit. Now, what was interesting is I had brought up, I said, there's something that really irritates me about people like this. And I said, mainly what came out of me is I said, I can't stand freeloaders. And somebody had the audacity when I brought that up to say, well, that's really a mirror of who you are. And I said, no, I really don't think so. My attitude is I think everybody should contribute at least as equal as they possibly can. I mean, the differences. And they said, no, this is really about you. And so when I read that in your book, I go, thank God that this isn't just me, that there are a lot of people out there that feel really the same way about that sense of fairness. And if I wasn't truthful and you weren't truthful about that, really, how did you feel about what happened in 2008 and beyond when it came to the big meltdown?
Well, this is the point. The fury we all felt was because the very same people who engineered it, who have put millions of people out of work, who have killed so many pension plans for all of us, who have, so many people have been made homeless as a result. These are the very same people who awarded themselves record bonuses after engineering this, record bonuses for failure and catastrophe.
And don't watch The Inside Job because that'll really piss you off.
Well, of course it is, because the point is we actually all feel acutely unfairness because it's hardwired into us. This is what I've written about in the Bond. We all have an "it's not fair" button in our brains, and that "it's not fair" button registers acutely when we take too much, or we're given too little, or someone else takes too much. And there have been many studies of this that demonstrated over and over again with a thing called game theory. Now, game theory is used by economists and evolutionary biologists to see how human beings and animals behave, particularly under difficult circumstances. Put them in a tight spot and see what comes naturally to them. And with human beings, they test our desire for fairness through a thing called the public goods game. Now, with this, imagine there's a group of about 10 of us, and we're all given $10, and we all have to put a certain amount in the pot. Now, the pot is going to be redistributed to all of us. And the secret of the game that no one knows is the more you give, the more everybody gives together, the more you'll get back. Everybody will get more by doing that. And it's sort of supposed to see, our civic engagement, like would we all give to take care of the parks in California, for instance. Right. So initially, most people are generous. But occasionally and usually there's one or two people who are freeloaders, as you say, who have got a lot but refuse to give any to the public goods. So this is what happens. The other people start getting pissed off about it, just as you were, and they put in less the next time. And then in all kinds of subsequent rounds, they put in less and less until the game finally falls apart. So that's pretty much where we are in America right now. We're in a public goods game that nobody wants to play. We've got to a situation of a culture of such greed and individuality that we cannot see that working together helps everybody more. But the thing that you're talking about too is in us, we want fairness. We are generous, we are fair in ourselves, but we expect that back. We expect reciprocity, and we have a strong sense of that. And when it isn't that way, we pull back ourselves, and that's what's going on now.
Now, it's interesting because many years ago I had the opportunity to interview with a local author. She was actually a professor at the University of Oregon here in Oregon. And she says, once you recognize the problem, you automatically become the solution. And we seem to be in that day and age, at least at this point, that we just don't feel that we want to be that solution because it seems once we become that somebody comes along and kicks that aside and it becomes irrelevant anyway. But the beauty of that is we really all really want to give, that we want to be part of a solution, that we want to even in some cases be the solution. And then somebody kind of comes in and rewrites the rules and says, but it needs to happen this way. And again, it's about that sense of fair play again.
Mhm. Well, the thing is, we don't understand. We think we're all sitting back and waiting for the big guys in charge to fix things.
Right.
We think that they'll make it all better for us. And we don't realize that, we can be the change. That when this was the interesting thing about this game theory stuff I've been telling you about. One thing that they found was it doesn't take much to change a game of selfishness, a game of greed. All it takes is a few people who are wedded to strong reciprocation, to making sure that everybody gives their fair share, to change the whole game around. So what they're saying is all they need are a few little game changers to change a whole culture. Now, I think that it's not going to happen from top to bottom.
No.
I think it's going to happen from bottom upward. I think it's going to happen, and I have great faith in small groups, because small groups are the way every revolutionary change in America has occurred through small groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's really important that we understand that even small things, small actions of generosity change the game. And when you change the currency from greed to generosity, the whole game gets changed. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that human beings are so infected by each other. We're all so contagious. Our moods, our actions are very, very contagious. And that's another thing I wrote about earlier in the Bond, is that, it spreads. Things like happiness, loneliness, even overeating spread down social networks. They've had studies showing that if you're happy, you're more likely to have happy friends. And that's not because you self-select happy people. It's because of the natural spread of happiness down in social network. Same thing of overeating. There was an amazing study that plunked somebody in a restaurant who started mindlessly eating, and they noticed that all of the people around him started mindlessly eating too. We're just so infected by each other. It's all such a ripple effect. And the same thing happens with generosity and pay-it-forward activity. It ripples. Scientists have shown this in Harvard, that one act of generosity affects not only your friends, but your friends' friends and your friends' friends' friends. It goes 3 degrees down a social network. So you can imagine that one little act of generosity can set off a contagion of giving.
Mm-hmm. I know you actually described an experiment where there was a person that was set within a group. I believe his name was Rick. And it was all about his moods that actually influenced, how well or unwell the group would actually be effective. And I remember back in the workplace that was so true, that you could have, say, 15 people working together, but if that one came in the sour mood, how much that one can affect the whole group and their productivity and their creative ways of thinking. And you think to yourself, as you hear many times over the years, especially in America, about the self-made man, or the guy that did it all on his own to, climb the corporate ladder and own everything. And the fact is, as you were saying in your book, that we're actually a product in some ways of the people and the environment around us, because that's just how we adapt in order to fit in.
Absolutely. That's how we want to fit in. And so, if we're in a culture of greed, and also we're so reciprocal. So if we're in a culture of greed in an office, say, in a neighborhood or whatever, we need to fit in so badly that we'll do the same. Mm-hmm. And they found, though, that, as you say, they did this with a study. They used somebody in a study of business to show that his moods completely influenced everybody, negotiations, everything. If he was in a good mood, everybody was generous. If he was in a bad mood, people were picky and didn't want to put as much money in and didn't want to be as generous. So we are so affected by each other. So all it requires is a few little game changers in every little community to change the whole game around. And people respond to this so much. because it's in our nature to share, care, and be fair. We hear it, and it's like a song we've forgotten, and it's so familiar to us whenever we see this. It's how we're really made to be. We're made to be, what scientists have found, and I denoted in the bond too, is that, giving and generosity, even altruism, are the natural state of being in a healthy person who's been brought up with love. It's selfishness that's the pathology. That's the outproduct of a or the byproduct of a defective environment, a dysfunctional environment when the child was young. So we're made to do this. So all it requires is a couple of people to say, we're changing the game now. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll show you how it can work on such a tiny level. I talk about in my book a woman called Marie. Now, Marie decided that she was sick of her office and its culture of typical greed and
office politics and be this way and you might get here.
Exactly, all that ugly stuff. Mm-hmm. So she decided that every day in her coffee break she was going to leave change in the Coke machine and leave a note that said, "Your Coke's been paid for. Keep the spirit alive and pay it forward." So she starts doing this. Her office workers freak out. They don't know what's happened with this. They create a spy network around the Coke machine to try to find out who the secret Santa is.
Overchange.
Overchange. There's a neighborhood watch scheme happening here. So Marie gets wind of this, and she moves to a different floor, and she starts leaving donuts out. And this ends up and leaves her note every day, too. So this completely freaks out the office. It changes the conversation for weeks and weeks. It changes the office environment. It reminds people about how they're really supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So those little acts like that can be absolutely potent game changers. And when generosity is the currency, the game changes.
Lynn, it's interesting. You brought up a memory that I hadn't thought about in quite a long time when you brought up this Coke machine. And that is, I remember there was a time that I was living in a small apartment complex, and on each level there was a laundry room. And fortunately, mine was just a door and a half away, so it was almost like having a washer and dryer in my own apartment. But there would be that time it was just one washer and dryer that I would go in there and somebody's clothes would be in the wash, and I'd want to get to start my wash. So I thought, well, what am I going to do about this? And I thought, well, why not just do this? Yeah, to me, it seemed to be the courteous thing to do. And the beauty about this action is this really is not only within all of us, but it's practiced more often than we're being led to believe. You watch the news long enough, and it's going to make you think that everybody's out to get you. Nobody gives a damn whether you live or die. The fact is, you shut that off and you step outside your door, and you're going to realize, where do these people come up with these stories? But anyway, what had happened is I would actually pull the clothes out of the wash, put them into the dryer, put my own change in there, fire it up, and get those clothes dried. I mean, after all, eventually I'm going to need the dryer anyway. And think about how you would feel, for instance, if you went in there, somebody threw your wet clothes on top of the dryer, and then your clothes were done and you threw them in the dryer. Now, here's what's even more interesting. I took it to another level just because of how I felt about doing it. It was sort of that do unto others as you would have done unto you. But I actually had this in practice in this little Simply laundry room. So what would happen really was this. This blew my mind. When I went to get my clothes out of the washer to put them into the dryer, somebody had actually put my clothes into the dryer, and then they put change of themselves in, so my clothes were already drying. So I even took it to the next level and started having fun with this. I figured, it's in a very big apartment complex. It's only a matter of time before we get to know whoever each other is anyway. And so there was a time that clothes were drying, and, of course, they were done, and I pulled them out of the dryer, and I started folding them. Not my clothes, somebody else's. And they came walking in on me like, hey. And you could just see the look on their face like they couldn't believe this. You can't believe the ripple effect of something that simple, because the same thing happened to me over time. And there was this interesting laundry co-op going on here, and I thought to myself, see, that shows it inherently that we're not only, as you've even got a chapter titled, born to give, but that we want to do the good thing just because it feels good to simply do it.
Absolutely. We're hardwired to feel as good about giving altruistically as about caring for our young, as about eating or having sex. nature's designed us to feel good about that. And as you say, one little action, your folding, creates a stampede of the thing. You created a whole ripple effect yourself, a little contagion of giving in that one little thing. Now imagine if we do this on a couple of different levels. Just imagine if we start doing this, say, in our office. Instead of out elbowing each other out, suppose we start sharing with each other on some little thing. When you've come up with a project, sharing it with someone else, bringing it and deliberately, not always trying to grab the brass ring for yourself, but just sharing it with everyone else. And suddenly, that becomes the culture in your office. Work becomes a pleasure to go to every day because people see it's okay to do that. We don't have to just eat each other up. And you can do this in your neighborhood. If you decide that, having a neighbor isn't all about showing off my Mercedes to your Volvo. Maybe ostentation doesn't have to be the currency in my neighborhood. Maybe it's about sharing. Maybe it's about somebody's having a problem with their lawn and it doesn't look as good as ours, and going over there and working with them to make it better. Imagine if you started doing that. You'd suddenly create this contagion in your neighborhood of the landscape brigade, which, often was the case when I was growing up. If there was somebody having a problem in the neighborhood, it's almost like we had a neighborhood without fences.
Right.
The dads would be over there fixing their whatever it was that needed fixing, and next week they'd be over fixing something else in somebody else's place. And that kind of neighborhood unity has pretty much broken down now,
Especially when you talk about the gated communities. I thought, now this is interesting because people are developing neighborhoods literally, to me, what would seem to be prisons. Although you've got the freedom to come and go. Well, not necessarily in some cases because you got to check in with security. But the fact is, you're building a prison for people to break into.
You are, and there's no evidence that it is more secure. I mean, there's been some studies of gated community versus ungated community, and they found that there's a little less crime against the person. There's very similar crime statistics between gated and ungated communities. So it doesn't do what it ostensibly is supposed to do, but really what it's all about is status, about living with people who are just like me, about keeping outsiders out, all of those things, about exclusivity being the big badge that you're wearing. And that's not necessarily creating that neighborhood we have in our mind, which is that romantic image of people leaning across the garden fence and waving to each other and helping each other out. That gets created with a different currency, a currency of generosity.
I couldn't help but think of a Jerry Seinfeld comedy bit where he was talking about being on the airline and you're back there in coach and you notice that stewardess stands there at the curtain going to first class, looking at all of you with such scorn, and just sort of with a thought, if you had only just worked a little harder, and shuts the curtain on everybody. And I thought, well, maybe it's a little more comfortable up there, but you're going to land first if we crash.
That's great.
Now, what I really love about what you wrote about, especially in the giving part, is because a lot of us tend to think that the human gene is selfish, it's survival of the fittest, that we've actually taken that attitude and seen that in nature that this is just as true, when it comes to the hunters, that go out and they seek out prey. The ones that are the strongest tend to actually, grab their fair share and they don't share with anything else. And then there was a guy that you had actually mentioned by the name of Robert Trivers who believed that altruism was sort of an anomaly, that just isn't something that happened. But the truth is that's really who we are, and that the fittest are actually there for the survival of the whole. That, as you had even talked about in your book, that even different species would tend to actually put themselves on the line, if you will, if it meant that it would help something else. And there was an interesting segment that we had done a couple of years ago on whales. And what was interesting is that he was sharing a story in there about some fishermen that were within a cove, and it was up near Alaska, and they said it was really fascinating because a pod of killer whales had come around and recognized, for however it was that they did, that these were fishermen trying to catch fish. So in cooperation, they started kind of swimming around and throwing their echoes and actually herding the salmon into the nets. And you hear so many examples of that. Now, this is, an animal that, just like a lot of the animals in the sea or even on land that we've exploited, but they still tend to reach across and say, we're all in this together. Look what we can help you do. And trying to give us the lesson, why don't you just be kind and nice to our environment? And sometimes you can take a look at the overall picture and go, oh my God, what have we really done here? But realize we're really trying to move in a different direction here, and we need to stop the nonsense that's going on. And I think that your book really puts a lot of this together that says inherently in all of us, we have that natural, divine, genetic ability to be good, but we also have the choice on how we exercise that. And we're not genetically predispositioned to be bad, even though we used to think that's the way it was, but it's very elastic. We can change. And as you read through this, you can see how many pieces of research that you feature in here, experiments, you go on and on and on about the thing, that makes a person walk away going, maybe it's time to take the first step in the right direction.
Well, that was what I hoped it would be. I hoped this book would be a clarion call to us because, the real bottom line here is that we have a choice right now. We're probably the most important generation that has ever lived, not because there's so many of us as baby boomers, but I'm talking about old and young. Everything we do is going to affect not only our children and our children's children, but all people for all time. Where it's such a crucial point of our evolution. And, we can continue to march down the road that we're marching down toward greater atomization and greater ring fencing of things and their differences and greater individualism. Or we can embrace the opposite impulse, which is our real birthright, which is holism and connection, and understand that when we connect, we're strong. When we compete, we're weak. And we're in a mess right now because we've followed this mindset. It's time we have to change. And it's true that, as I say, the studies have shown that we were born to do this. We were born to share, care, and be fair. Giving, it's been demonstrated in so many ways from animals to human beings that we were, that, as I say, the healthiest of us demonstrate ability to give. Babies, before they've been socialized, demonstrate an ability to give unselfishly, a desire to do that unthinkingly without any kind of reward. It's in there. It's hardwired. And the problem is we've just trained ourselves differently with the greed culture, with the selfish culture, with the idea that and the narrative that we have selfish genes. This is not a true narrative. It's a false narrative, and it's time to write a new one. So what I've tried to do in the Bond is not only rewrite the new story, but also provide people with a blueprint of the 4 important things that we have to retrain ourselves on, which is seeing the whole, learning how to relate to each other very differently so that we put the relationship first, not just what's in it for me.
Right.
Connecting with people in small groups in a different way so that we can reach across the greatest divides, even with people who reject everything we stand for, how we can come together. And there are very simple ways. And also changing our life's purpose. This doesn't mean we give up the day job, but it means that doesn't become getting and spending for me and mine alone, do not become our ultimate purpose in life, because there's something much bigger beyond that, much more satisfying.
I think, too, what might be interesting, and certainly you can expound a thought on this, is I believe, the way that we look at charity. We look at charity as though these are people in need and they can't do for themselves, when in fact charity is simply about giving. And there's a great Buddhist precept that I like to live by where I simply give without recognition that I've actually done that. So it's sort of like dropping that special gift. You talked about the lady with the change machine, or you've heard, why don't you, as you're paying the toll, pay the toll for the person behind you. I actually did this in a store once where there were a couple of kids and they were throwing their candy, their bubble gum, their soda pop up there. And then they were scrambling around for the money to pay for this. And as they were distracted by that, I said to the clerk, put my finger up to my mouth as to say, be quiet, here, pay for this.
That's
just
sweet.
as they brought the money up, the clerk says to him, "No, you guys are good. Go ahead and pack up and go." And it was funny to watch them stand there and look at each other like, "What? We could just walk out of here without paying for it?" But I took no credit for it, which I didn't want to, but it was just fun to watch the scene, which was really above and beyond what the precept really means. It's simply just walk away and leave the gift, kind of a thing.
Right.
But sometimes it's just fun to do that, but be anonymous, but just see what happens. And it'll make your whole day.
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the guys in my book, Nipun Mehta, who was the prototypical Silicon Valley Turk, on six figures when he was right out of college, got sick of all of this, culture of greed, particularly because he was reminded when he had been in India and standing by the side of the street and ill, a little old Indian came up to him on a bicycle, pulled out of a sack a lemon, cut it in half and gave it to him to stop the nausea, and then just rode off. And it just stunned him. It was like this person had just come up in his hour of need, shared, probably it was his last piece of fruit, and nevertheless he shared half of it, and then just disappeared without needing any credit, which was so different from the kind of, situation he found at home where people might give to charities, but that was as ostentatious as everything else about their lives. So he just found that, wow, you're giving without any desire to receive anything in return, and that's what he wanted to emulate.
Because they understand also the underlying principle, even though it may or may not be the motivation behind it, that what you actually give out to the world, you really do receive back in miraculous tenfold ways. It's quite incredible. I remember being broken down, for instance, on a bridge at night, ran out of gas of all things. Now, this got pretty scary because the bridge was one lane going one way and one lane going the other. Actually, no, two lanes both ways, but I'm literally in the middle of this at night, and it's scary when you're sitting out there and you're in the lane. There is no turnoff on this bridge. You're in one of the lanes, even though you're to the right side. Seeing headlights coming at you, wondering, and you can see them almost at times seeming at the last minute swerving around me. And what was interesting was, just as I was breaking down, there was a truck behind me, and the lady got out and she says, "What happened? Did you run out of gas? Do you need to use a cell phone?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course." So I called my towing service. And then, they were on their way, but I thought, well, that was kind of neat. I mean, there was somebody immediately right there with a cell phone, because I don't carry one. And then it was probably about 5 to 10 minutes later, an officer shows up, and he says, "Okay, so you got a towing service?" He says, "Well, I'm going to go ahead and hang back here until they show up." So he, of course, parks a good, 50, 60 feet from where I was, lights blaring and everything. And I felt safe because I wasn't looking at those headlights coming at me, but for a while I was. But the fact that happened so quickly, the fact that there was that immediate help, and I remember one time walking through a mall with my wife, and there was a kiosk selling cell phones. "Do you have one of these?" Trying to rope us into buying that. And I said, "No, as a matter of fact, we don't." And they said, "Well, you should think about upgrading." And I said, "No, we actually don't have a cell phone." And she says, "Well, you really need a cell phone." I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, let me tell you an interesting story. We're way out what seemingly could be out in the middle of nowhere in the Columbia Gorge. Again, broke down, and no cell phone. And we sat up there, and we just pulled out our chairs. We were actually on our way out to camp. And so we're waiting for the tow truck to show up. But what was funny was, without a tow truck, a cell phone, we sat there, and people just randomly would pull out, "Hey, I'm looking for directions to this. Hey, would it be okay if we use your cell phone because we're actually calling it to..." "Oh, yeah, here you go." We sat there, and we were, constantly, we were up there for about 3.5 hours stuck, but eventually the towing service showed up. But through that time, on an average of every 30 minutes, somebody would show up. "Yeah, go ahead, use my cell phone and check on the status of that." Somebody was always available.
Yes, I know.
And that's
it's
the beauty
amazing,
of the holistic way that you're looking at the world, especially through your book. Open your eyes. It's a lot better than you're being led to believe.
It is a lot better. I mean, and I was amazed at some of the evidence showing that even in York, when they did a study once with psychology students who were, there had one person dressed up as an actor who was collapsing on the subway, and it was a very crowded subway going up to the Bronx, of all places. And nevertheless, 89% of the time, people helped without thinking, and most of them were multiple groups of people who would just try to help. Even when they used an actor pretending to be a drunk, You
right.
know, more than 50% of the time people helped too.
I thought it was funny. It was only 50%, but at least that many people were willing to.
Sure, you know, even if they were probably, you know, disapproving of him
right.
getting into his own problem or whatever, they still nevertheless helped when he collapsed. So it's really quite amazing that, you know, people just help without thinking. Air France bus collapsed, you know, an Airbus collapsed and crashed right outside of Toronto near a highway, and the government felt that everybody had died, and so they notified the relatives. But then they soon had to revise it because what had happened is so many bystanders driving by on the highway had just pulled over, run into the plane, and dragged people out of the plane before it was in flames. And, you know, this was after 9/11 when it could have been a terrorist attack.
Sure.
Nevertheless, people were happy to jump into a burning plane without thinking.
Right. You know, when I think of 9/11, I remember when that particular day happened, and I was at one of the strangest places, and I share the story because of how eerie it really was, how I discovered that 9/11 had actually happened. I had slept in that particular day till about noon, thought I would have or go out to enjoy breakfast at one of my favorite places, and turned on the radio, and you know, when we let you know more about this event, but I didn't know what was going on, but there was no music playing on anything, and so, you know, there was the world passing by me on the West Coast. So I get to my destination, and I go to walk up to go into the restaurant, and sure enough, there's the front page showing the World Trade Centers, and I'm like, what's this all about? And then, of course, I go in, I sit down, and then I begin to realize the gravity of what had actually happened. The strangest thing is this, Lynn. I don't know. These are those strange occurrences that let you know there's something much bigger than you out there. The place that I actually had breakfast has a B-17 bomber right out in front of it, and it's called the Bomber.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, that's the weird part about it. But here's, as I began to absorb and drive away from all that, as everybody must have been in shock. I mean, you went into this dream world like, did this really just happen? And one of my first thoughts was of compassion. Somebody had to love these people enough to nurture them to the level to grow up to be able to do this act that they did. But something changed in them, that sort of group philosophy, as you're talking about, the need to belong. And they did this. But then our reaction to it seemed to be just the opposite of let's go get them. It seemed to be more of let's understand why this happened in the first place. Let's reach out to this. You know, people were starting to want to learn about the Muslim culture. Who are these people? That was really the headline. And it was only a matter of time before it shifted, and pretty soon now we wanted retribution and carried it out. And as many people around the world agree about the United States, in the ugliest way imaginable. And you think, how did we allow this to happen? You know, but it has. But the thing
the sad thing is, the sad thing is we had everybody's sympathy. And of course I say this living over here in the UK, everyone put out American flags in their window after 9/11. It was such a great outpouring of pain and sympathy for us. And we blew it. And then there were probably the biggest protest movement ever in the UK when America dragged the UK into the Afghanistan war. There were millions of people protesting that war over here, and it just got ignored. It was just terrible. And there was no good reason for America to be in it, but there was even less good reason for the UK to be in it. So, you know, it was just terrible shame. And the same thing with the Iraqi war. There was no good reason for the UK to get dragged into it, too. So, you know, you're right. Initially, the thing was, well, why would they hate us so much? We must find out about this. But the point is that I try to make in the book that terrorists, like the people who were involved with 9/11, don't kill for a cause. They kill to belong.
Exactly.
It's kind of the price of belonging. They're expected to do this and to be loved and appreciated and accepted. They're willing to even give their own lives. That's how much we need to belong.
And Lynn, you bring up an interesting point, too, because there was a movie I remember seeing many years ago, and it was called Higher Learning. And it's about more or less the experience of going into college. And There is one particular Caucasian male who's having a really difficult time finding his way. It seems like nobody really wants him to belong to anything. So eventually he gets involved with sort of one of those radical groups that you're talking about and ends up killing the girlfriend of one of the students. And those kind of acts actually happen when somebody just feels separated from the group. It's the same with the shootings at Columbine. You see these isolated incidences, and as you point out, and it seems to be pretty consistent, it's because these people are outcasts.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, the sad element of it is that it's taken as the norm of human behavior, and that's not true. It's not. No. It's, and of course with the Columbine killing, the irony is one of the guys, when they walked into the high school and blew away all of their students with semi-automatics, one of the guys was wearing a T-shirt called Natural Selection. They were using Darwinian model as a justification for sociopathic activity,
Yeah, Darwin was way off base, wasn't he, when he would say these skipping genes were actually anomalies when, in fact, we're made to be adaptable to our environment quickly, even into the very next generation.
Absolutely. And, the new evidence about that demonstrates it without a shadow of a doubt that the environment affects whether genes will be expressed, but even affects whether or not, even changes genes. We're having a lot of new evidence to suggest that the environment can change genes. So we are a product of our environment, built from the outside in, not from inside out, as we always thought.
For those of you just joining us, the book is The Bond. It's Connecting Through the Space Between Us. Our guest today, Miss Lynne McTaggart. Such a wonderful piece of work. Is there a website people can find out more about this work?
Yes, thank you. It's www.thebond.net. And I also wanted to let you know that we're starting a fairness campaign. If people come to the website and log in and join us, they'll get information about our fairness campaign, which is to provide fairness principles to help people engage in fairness in their lives, to encourage fairness, to become game changers for fairness and the bond. They can also get a free extract from the book from the website, and they'll get more information about a big upcoming teleseminar that I'm doing in mid-July.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Lynne McTaggart, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program, and so encouraging to know that people are actually putting work out there that let us know that who we are may not be entirely our fault, but who we become certainly is. Lynne, thank you for being on the program today.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much.
You bet. We also want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. Be sure to visit us at our website, which is beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.